views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. Tonight's guest has been behind a city council law to tighten up on landlords who have been gaming the system. He's also investigated a city jobs program and found there's no accountability. He's been outspoken about remarks by a council colleague that he calls homophobic, and he's also indicated that he wants to run for Congress. We have a lot to talk about with Councilmember Ritchie Torres tonight, so please join me in welcoming the councilman from the 15th Council District from the Bronx neighborhoods of, he knows them, Bedford Park, Fordham, Mount Hope, Bathgate, Belmont, East Tremont, West Farms, Van Ness, Allerton, and Olinville. Welcome back. And Fordham.
Yes.
Did I miss Fordham? Oh, well.
Fordham.
All right. Councilmember Ritchie Torres, nice to have you with us.
An honor to be here.
Let's just talk a little bit about theory, about philosophical theory and how you approach things, and certainly some of the words that have been bandied about. And I'm thinking about the word progressive.
Yeah.
What does it mean to be a progressive? Do we have progressives in New York City government? How do you view yourself? Give me just your perspective of that whole concept.
Well, the most important word in the term progressive is progress. Ultimately, as an elected official, I should be judged by the progress that I produce for my constituents, whether my constituents are better off because of the leadership that I've demonstrated to them. So ultimately, I think the term progressive is about delivering results for your constituents. It's not about checking the right ideological boxes. It's not about passing ideological litmus tests. It's about producing progress, producing improvements in the lives of the people you represent.
You have been it's no secret, a frequent critic of the mayor. You certainly have been that way on this program and certainly in some of the work you've done. He came into office and touted himself as a progressive. Has it been a progressive government? Maybe not, or maybe not the way you've defined it. Has he strayed from that notion? Has the city strayed from that notion? Just characterize more for us, if you would.
Look, I think the mayor has been a profound disappointment. I think from the moment he entered public office, he had no real interest in the day-to-day details of governing the city. He was in a rush to appoint himself as the savior of a national progressive movement. And now he's running for president of the United States at a time when NYCHA is experiencing a state of emergency and a humanitarian crisis, and homelessness continues to spiral out of control, and the New York City economy shows real signs of slowing down. So he's far from progressive in the sense that matters. He's not producing more progress for New York City.
You have concerns, you've always expressed concerns, as you've just done now, about his mayoralty, but do you have concerns about him traveling while he's still the mayor?
I mean, his first responsibility should be to the people of New York City, right? The notion that New York City is in such great shape that we can afford to have an absentee mayor is delusional.
Or have him operating by phone, which is what he says he would do.
There's no, you can rely on your deputy mayor for management, but leadership can only come from one place, the mayor of the city of New York. Only the mayor can effectively move the bureaucracy in New York City, and his absence does real harm to the people of New York.
We started out talking about politics, and it's no secret that, and I mentioned it at the top of the show, you've expressed interest in running for Congress. You haven't officially announced. I mean, I think it's maybe the worst kept secret in the Bronx political scene right now. Talk to me about the potential run for Congress, when you might officially announce, and of course, then why you would pursue that.
I remain in the exploratory stage, so I've made no final decision, but an announcement will come in the weeks or months to come. But, the congressional district, the congressional seat in the South Bronx, it's the only congressional district exclusively in the Bronx. It's the most consequential office in the Bronx, and whoever occupies the office is going to have a real impact in confronting poverty. As you know, the South Bronx is said to be the poorest congressional district in America. It's ground zero for racially concentrated poverty. Most of the policies that one would need to implement to fight poverty effectively, those policies are set at the federal level. And so that would be the reason I would want to run for Congress.
Your colleague in the city council, Reverend Diaz, said that the council is controlled by the homosexual community. He said he claimed that what he said is not homophobic. He said it's the truth. And then there were those other comments that he's not going to rat his people out when it comes to sexual harassment. He is running for Congress. What are your thoughts about, should something further be done or to censor him in the city council? Or at this point, let he said what he said and move on?
Look, the council member is beyond reform. There's no changing his behavior. But if he were elected to Congress, it would be an embarrassment for the Bronx. It would be an embarrassment for the city of New York. He has no business serving in public office in general, much less Congress.
CNN had a fascinating analysis. How interesting, coming from CNN, that they took such an interest in the race for this particular seat, which is Jose Serrano's seat, which he is going to be retiring, as he announced. And they talked about Michael Blake has announced he wants to run. They mentioned two other names, people you know well, Marlene Cintron and Gustavo Rivera. Do you have fears that, as they speculated, and it's all talk at this point, that if there were four candidates like you, Michael Blake, Marlene Cintron, and Gustavo Rivera, that would split a more left-handed vote, and then Councilmember Diaz would win the seat?
It's a plausible analysis, right? If the race is too crowded, it could work to the advantage of Councilmember Diaz because he has high name recognition. He was once the state senator for the district that has the largest overlap with the congressional. So he's not to be taken lightly as a contender for Congress.
Well, I guess what I'm suggesting, would it at some point say to you or Mr. Blake or Ms. Cintron or Senator Rivera that maybe we ought to band together rather than compete against each other and make sure, and kind of come together on one candidate?
That's not how elections work, you know that, so.
Okay, fair enough. I appreciate that answer. Let's talk a little bit about policy. And you have stood back on single-payer health care. Want to talk about why that is? I mean, if we're talking about progressive and progress, would that not be appropriate progress?
No, there are strong arguments for single-payer, right? But keep in mind, in the Bronx, healthcare is a fourth of the Bronx economy. The largest employer in the Bronx is Montefiore. We have a large and heavily unionized healthcare workforce. And so my only point was not to convey opposition to single-payer, but was to say what the devil's in the details. We have to make sure whatever bill is introduced in Congress does not have a destabilizing effect on 1/4 of the Bronx economy. So I want to pursue a transformation of the healthcare system that has the buy-in of institutions like Montefiore and institutions like 1199, because healthcare is not one industry among many. It is the centerpiece of the Bronx economy, and it's something that we have to regulate carefully.
And I guess the other philosophical, or in a way it's philosophical, but it's been put out, and that is the idea of the Green New Deal. Again, using labels, is it progressive? Is it socialistic? You have not been a supporter. Just give me a...
No, I would call myself a supporter of the Green New Deal. If by Green New Deal you mean a massive infrastructure investment in clean energy and renewable energy, then I would support it for two reasons, because it addresses the two greatest challenges of our time, climate change and the jobs crisis. So both of those can be addressed under the banner of the Green New Deal.
Regardless of what it's called, you want to see some reform in our approach.
There's no
to
question that
climate
we
change.
have to shift away from our dependency on fossil fuels and move toward renewable energy, which is an opportunity to create jobs for those who are structurally unemployed, but it's also an opportunity to reverse the impact of global warming and climate change.
We've done very well in the Bronx with these solar farms, and I don't know exactly which neighborhoods. My sense is they're mostly southern. Is it the kind of thing that you could see expanding, and at least in your current council district, without looking ahead, and have those that kind of infrastructure applied?
We'll take public housing. As you know, public housing has been plagued by decades of disinvestment, has $32 billion worth of capital needs. What the federal government should do is not merely reinvest $32 billion, but make it a laboratory for the Green New Deal, right? Install green roofs and solar panels and wind turbines, and there are opportunities for local procurement and worker-owned cooperatives. So I think the Green New Deal could be a game changer for the United States. It's a stimulus package, it's an infrastructure investment for our future.
That's a fascinating concept. So if we have the ability to deliver solar panels to numerous buildings.
Don't simply rebuild the way it was.
And you could save some money, of course, add some jobs, deal with rooftops and properties, and I guess the privatization issue is a larger one, but if you could turn those rooftops into efficient energy producing infrastructure, that would be pretty good.
What could send a more powerful message than to take the most dilapidated part of our housing stock and transform it into the gold standard of green, affordable housing? I think public housing is the best laboratory for a Green New Deal.
Let's talk about this so-called Kushner loophole that you have been, squarely behind trying to close. The Housing Rights Initiative certainly had taken the lead. Talk to me about what was and what has happened.
So in partnership with Housing Rights Initiative, led by Aaron Carr, I conducted an investigation into Kushner Companies and found that Kushner Companies had a pattern of lying to the city of New York. Our investigation uncovered more than 80 falsified building permits across 34 properties in the span of 4 years. And why is this important? It's the falsification of building permits is not only about bureaucratic paper shuffling. It poses a real threat to the affordability of rent-regulated units and the safety of residents who live in those units during periods of construction. I call it the weaponization of construction, the use of illegal construction as a weapon for harassing tenants out of their home and deregulating apartments out of existence.
And so just to be specific, what they lied about is that they had no rent-regulated tenants.
Exactly. So there's something known as in order to conduct construction, you need to obtain a building permit. There's something known as a PW1, which has 26 sections. Section 26 will ask you two of the following questions. 1, will you have occupied units during construction? 2, do you have rent-regulated units in your building? When it came to both of those questions, Kushner Companies, as well as other companies, had a consistent pattern of lying to the city of New York under oath without consequence. But the scandal was not only the deception of Kushner Companies, the scandal was a lack of enforcement by the Department of Buildings. We were able to uncover these lies simply by reviewing publicly available information. We took a look at building permit data from the Department of Buildings and property tax data from the Department of Finance and found Kushner Companies would tell one thing to the Department of Finance and then say something else to the Department of Buildings. It would tell the Department of Finance it had rent-regulated units in its buildings and then tell the Department of Buildings it had no rent-regulated units in those very same buildings, and the right hand of city government did not know what the left hand was doing because there was no coordination, there was no information sharing.
And it was not one building. This was a pattern. In other words, like, gee whiz, you make a mistake. So I got to understand this. Maybe I'm incredibly naive. I fill out a form to apply for anything with the city of New York or the state of New York. It says clearly, you sign this, you're indicating that everything in this document is true, et cetera, under oath, et cetera,
under penalty of perjury.
So now that this apparently has been discovered, is there a penalty coming for either Mr. Kushner or others, or of course now with his position in federal government, that becomes a little more complicated, but is that on the way?
So we passed legislation that closes the Kushner loophole in enforcement. So the legislation has 3 provisions. If an application is found to be falsified, then the Department of Buildings would be required to conduct an audit of the whole real estate portfolio of the applicant. And if the Department of Buildings finds a pattern of lying and deception, then it would be required to refer the matter to a law enforcement agency like the Attorney General's office for criminal prosecution. The third provision is it would require information sharing among the Department of Finance, the Department of Buildings, and DHCR so that the left hand of government
So,
knows what the
no-
right hand is doing.
But it's actually a fascinating thing because you say it's called the Kushner loophole, but the legislation is not geared specifically in that direction. It's geared toward the city to make the city enforce the rules.
Exactly.
Wow.
And
interesting.
And Kushner Companies is a poster child for a much wider problem throughout the real estate industry. This is about holding owners accountable for failing to tell the truth under oath and under the penalty of perjury.
Another aspect of this idea of measuring outcomes, and I'll tell you an anecdote. I was at a meeting of New York Works that was making a presentation to a community, and New York Works is apparently a part of the city government that has a kind of a job development program. And when I was listening to it, I heard, and they were saying, well, we have jobs, merchant jobs, we have jobs and maybe in restaurants. And I was saying, well, these are good, and we have many people that need jobs, and I hope they get them. But those aren't the jobs that are going to help someone, number one, feed their family or lead to a really good career that's kind of holding the line so you have a little money in your pocket now. What did you find about New York Works that was so troubling?
So we found a few problems. So first, a little context. Since 2014, the New York City economy has created well over 400,000 jobs. Right? The number of jobs is at a record high, 4.5 million. The citywide unemployment rate is at a record low, 4%. But even though the citywide average is 4%, in neighborhoods like Belmont, the unemployment rate could be as high as 15%. So the problem is not a lack of job creation per se. The problem is a lack of job creation in the poorest neighborhoods in our city. And the greatest indictment of New York Works is that it's failing to create jobs for those who need them the most. In a district like mine, the median level of educational attainment is less than a high school diploma. And those are precisely the people that New York Works leaves behind.
As I understood and did my own research on it, it was also a matter of saying, well, how many jobs did you create, and you didn't get quality, accurate information.
Exactly right.
That would seem strange if the city is investing in a program and then there's like, well, how did it go? Oh, I don't know. Talk a little bit
I
about
think you're right.
that.
We can only know.
Is that essentially
right.
what happened?
We can
I
only.
know I'm poking fun, but
We can only know what we measure, and we found that there is no measuring of outcomes when it comes to New York Works. So under New York Works, the mayor's office does not track the actual number of jobs it creates. It simply projects the number of jobs it hopes to create without tracking whether those projections become reality. So even though the administration counted 18,000 jobs, it actually only created 3,000. And even though it promised 100,000 jobs over the course of 10 years, it has so far created 3,000 jobs in the span of 2 years. So by year 10, we'll have only 18,000 rather than the 100,000 the mayor promised.
if you're a not-for-profit, maybe one of the many wonderful community centers we have in the Bronx, and you get a grant, and it's a city monies of some sort, could be a jobs development program, could be a summer camp program, could be any number of things, teach kids how to, play the piano, whatever it is. After or at some point, you have got to turn around and say, this is what we did with your money. It seems just remarkable to me that the city, how much money was that the city spent? Do you know offhand?
1.3, well, 300 million spent so far, but it's a $1.3 billion plan.
And it just seems remarkable to me that the city had to be forced. So now there's the legislation to force them to do this?
Well, we have an ongoing investigation. But
Investigation,
the
I see.
investigation will culminate in legislation that will bring greater transparency and accountability to the mayor's jobs plan. But it's a story that is true throughout the administration, whether it's Thrive NYC or Renewal Schools or New York Works. What we've seen from the administration is mismanagement on the scale of not hundreds, but billions of dollars.
Eyebrow-raising stuff that you're saying here. Let's talk a little bit about parks.
Yeah.
And there have been there's so much about our parks. In fact, I was over at a playground just yesterday, as a matter of fact, where the basketball court, the nets are falling down, the concrete obviously hasn't been repaved or finished or dealt with in any way for many years because it's been cracking and all that, and kids are playing on it. there are numerous stories about this sort of thing. You have advocated for a funding for parks of $100 million.
Yeah.
Is that citywide? Is that Bronx-wide? How did you come up with that number, and how does that compare with what we're spending currently on parks in whatever geographic center you choose?
Well, the $100 million investment, I see it as an emergency infusion. The Parks Department is so chronically under-resourced and understaffed that the Parks Department has less personnel today in a period of economic growth than it did in the 1970s in the midst of the financial crisis. So you have less staff than you've ever had in the Parks Department, responsible for 30,000 acres of land, right? Even though parkland represents 14% of New York City, the budget for the Parks Department is not 14% of the city budget. It's not even 1% of the city budget. It's 0.59%.
I think the kind of pulling out of resources out of the parks has been a systematic thing over a number of years. It's not like all of a sudden, well, we took it out of the budget this year. This has been happening through
But it's never been
Giuliani,
restored.
Bloomberg, and even now.
But it's never been restored before to pre-financial crisis levels.
And so, in your mind, how did you come up with $100 million? Is it just, well, we need $100 million, or do you think
it's a foundation on which we can make investments in the future? But our parks are chronically under-resourced. You know, there are young people in the Bronx who cannot afford to go to Disneyland or Disney World, whose only source of recreation is their park. We owe it to them to invest, to give their parks the investment they deserve.
there are those who could look and say, well, then Ritchie Torres is just a Democrat who doesn't understand budgets and who wants to just spend our money. Where does $100 million come from? Do you reallocate it from somewhere else? How do you get something like that
I think
in the sites and in the budgets?
If we quit wasting money on failed initiatives like New York Works and Thrive NYC and allocate it where we know it works, in our parks, that would be a good start.
Do you have specific parks in your neighborhood that, in your district, that could use fix-ups?
Well, it's not only my district, but...
I'm just asking about your neighborhood.
But the lack of funding for parks has a disproportionate impact on the Bronx, right? 3 of the largest parks are in the Bronx. We have Pelham Bay Park, which is the largest in the city, and it's triple the size of Central Park. You have Van Cortlandt, which ranks number 3, and then you have Bronx Park, which is in my district and ranks number 7. All of these parks are disproportionately affected by the lack of maintenance staff available at the Parks Department.
You were the chair of the Public Housing Committee, and evidenced through the dialogue here today, you still feel very strongly about public housing. Where are we at now in terms of, are we getting a better federal investment? You have, and others have done significant work on lead paint and lead paint removal and lead paint identification. Where are we at, and what do you recommend at this point happens?
I mean, I remain pessimistic about the future of public housing, A, because you have an absentee mayor, and B, because NYCHA has gone more than a year without a permanent chair. And so when you have no leadership either at City Hall or the New York City Housing Authority, there's a limit to the progress that NYCHA can make. You need leadership at City Hall, and you need a permanent chairperson.
Fascinating that you did not mention the federal government, which does provide funding.
No, but that has been a long-standing problem, right?
You had just assumed that was the problem.
Federal disinvestment is the root cause of NYCHA's humanitarian crisis, but that crisis is compounded by the lack of leadership in City Hall and the lack of a permanent chair.
What did you think of that HUD official sleeping in NYCHA apartments? I mean, is that an effective way to communicate to the federal government what NYCHA needs?
Okay. It tells us what we know, which is NYCHA's in a state of humanitarian crisis.
I guess we didn't need her. You could have asked many of the people who live in NYCHA.
No one is a greater expert on the day-to-day living conditions of public housing than the residents themselves, and those residents are paying a heavy price for the failure of the federal, state, and local government.
It's difficult to hear somebody in a position of responsibility say they're pessimistic about it. What's it going to take?
You need leadership. You need federal reinvestment. You need a mayor who's committed to preserving public housing for the long run. And you need a permanent chair who can fundamentally restructure the bureaucracy within NYCHA. Without those 3 elements, there's no hope for saving public housing.
I guess I want to conclude in a way with the same philosophical dialogue that we started at the beginning. So if you were to be a congressman, you would be a colleague of somebody right next door to you, and that would be Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She has become a lightning rod, for better or for worse, for many different things. What's your thought about where she's at right now, and then ultimately, if you were to be a Congress member, what your relationship with her would be, and what kinds of things would you feel good about, and what you'd be cautious about?
Look, I would hope to have a great working relationship with Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. You know, she is an impressively razor-sharp questioner. I've seen her at hearings, and she has a real talent for cross-examination.
Something I guess you would appreciate.
Which I appreciate as a city council, as the investigations chair in the New York City Council.
Right.
So that's an ethic that I would hope to bring to Congress if I were to run and to be elected. But you know, she represents the outside game of the Democratic Party, and change requires an outside game. Right? Change arises from a combination of the outside game and the inside game. Right? We would have never had the Civil Rights Act were it not for outsiders like Dr. King and insiders like Lyndon Johnson. And it's the combination of the outside game and the inside game that drives change in our society.
Mm-hmm. Can the Democratic Party, federal level, of course, the state here in the state of New York, there seems to be some vision, but not necessarily universally. Can it come together when there appears to be disparate communities, like a very progressive, some of course call it socialistic community, and others who are more traditional?
Absolutely, because the greatest unifying force of the Democratic Party is Donald Trump. And defeating Donald Trump is the overriding priority.
Do you feel like there's enough activity, enough volume at a Democratic Party right now?
I think the Democratic electorate has never been more energized. And every Democrat to whom I speak understands the urgency of defeating Donald Trump, who is an existential threat to the Republic, and he's an existential threat to everything that we believe in as Democrats.
An idea about when you might make a decision, when we might get
I'm in no rush.
Oh, okay. All right, you want to come here and make an announcement here? We could do that as well. Councilmember Ritchie Torres, always a pleasure to have you. We never hold back. You never hold back, and that makes for good Bronx dialogue. We appreciate you.
Always an honor. Thank you.
Thank you. Folks, if you have further questions or comments on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, email them to us at BronxTalk@BronxNet.org. You can send a tweet at Bronx Talk. I'll post them on our Facebook page. If you have questions for the council member, we can serve as the intermediary, as we are when we're on TV. Next week, we'll talk about a controversy developing in UPK programs. We thank our producers, Helen Greenberg, the directors are William Guzman and Nick Marrero, and we'll see you next week. Good night. Thank you.